Nathan's hand closed around her wrist before he even knew he'd moved right there on the crowded platform in front of every stranger in Red Hollow. "Let go of me," she gasped, but her voice shook harder than his hand did. "You died," he said. 20 years ago. I stood at an empty grave and said goodbye to you. Tell me I've lost my mind." Her eyes filled. "Nathan, I never died. I just never came back." "Then who did I write to for 3 months? Who signed those letters, Clara?" She pulled her hand free, chest heaving. "That was never my real name." Wyoming Territory. Summer of 1888. Before we go any further, if this story is already sitting heavy in your chest, hit that subscribe button and stay with us all the way to the end. And tell me, what city are you watching from tonight? I read every comment, and I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The Red Hollow Depot smelled like coal smoke and warm hay. Nathan Cole stood near the edge of the platform with his hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over between his fingers the way he always did when he was nervous and didn't want anyone to notice. Nobody noticed. Nobody ever really noticed Nathan. He was 36 years old. Tall, sun-worn quiet, in the way men get quiet when they've spent too many years talking mostly to horses and cattle instead of people. He owned the Coal Valley Ranch a few miles outside town, not the biggest spread in the territory, not the richest, but his. Built plank by plank with his own hands after his father died and left him nothing but debt and 200 acres of stubborn Wyoming dirt. He had buried both his parents by the time he was 25. He had watched half the friends of his childhood pack up and leave Red Hollow chasing gold, chasing railroads, chasing anything that wasn't this small forgotten town. And he had buried one more person a long time ago. Not in the ground, just in his memory where he visited her sometimes late at night when the ranch was too quiet and the wind through the pines sounded almost like a name. Sarah. He hadn't said that name out loud in probably 10 years. He told himself that loneliness was simpler than disappointment. A man who expected nothing couldn't be let down. That had been his whole philosophy for a decade. Work the land, tend the cattle, go to sleep before the silence in the house got too loud to bear. But 3 months ago, something in him had cracked open. He didn't fully understand why. Maybe it was turning 36. Maybe it was watching old man Hutchins get buried alone. No wife, no children, nobody but Nathan and the preacher standing over the grave. Maybe it was just that the house had gotten so quiet he'd started talking to it. Whatever it was, he'd ridden into town, sat down at the little writing desk in the back of the Mercantile, and placed an advertisement in a matrimonial paper out of Cheyenne. Rancher, honest, hardworking, seeks wife. Not a servant, a partner. He'd almost crossed out that last line. It felt foolish written down, but he'd left it. 3 women wrote back. 2 of them wanted to know how many acres he owned before they asked his name. The third signed her letter Clara Whitmore. Her words were different. She didn't ask about money. She asked if the winters were harsh and whether the ranch had a garden and whether he minded silence because she said she'd had enough noise in her life to last her the rest of it. "I am not looking for someone to rescue me," she wrote in her second letter. "I am looking for someone to build something with. If that is not what you are looking for, I understand." Nathan had read that line so many times the paper had gone soft at the fold. Something about her letters made the ranch feel less empty even before she arrived. He told himself that was foolish too. A man couldn't fall for handwriting. But here he was anyway, standing at the depot with his hat wrung nearly to pieces, waiting for a stranger named Clara Whitmore. The train's whistle cut through the afternoon. Nathan's stomach dropped straight through the platform boards. "Easy," he muttered to himself. "She's just a woman getting off a train." The brakes screamed. Steam rolled out low across the tracks. Doors opened one by one, and travelers began stepping down, a family with 3 children. A drummer in a checked suit hauling a trunk of samples, an old rancher Nathan recognized from the feed store. Then a woman in a faded blue dress stepped down, holding a small travel bag against her chest like it was the only thing in the world she still owned. She looked around the platform, searching faces. Nathan's whole body went still. She was older than he'd pictured. tired around the eyes in a way that spoke of more than one hard year. Her hair had come loose from its pins during the long ride, and she kept tucking a strand behind her ear with a nervous, unconscious motion. But it was the way she stood. The way she held her shoulders a little too straight, like she was bracing for something. The way her eyes moved, quick, careful, checking every corner before settling anywhere. Nathan had watched a little girl stand exactly that way 1,000 times 25 years ago, at the edge of a creek, ready to bolt the second anyone raised a voice. His heart stopped in his chest. "No," he whispered to himself. "It can't be." The woman's eyes finally landed on him, and she froze too. For one long, impossible second, neither of them moved. The platform noise, the shouting porters, the crying baby, the horses stamping outside, all of it seemed to fall away into nothing. Nathan's mouth opened before his mind caught up with it. Sarah. The bag slipped from her arms and hit the platform with a soft thud. The color drained out of her face so fast, Nathan thought she might faint right there. "Nathan!" Her voice came out as barely more than breath. He crossed the platform in 3 long strides and caught her wrist as she swayed, steadying her, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. They simply stared at each other, 20 years collapsing into a single held breath. "You died," Nathan finally said, his voice cracking. "Your family left in the middle of the night. Nobody in this town ever heard from you again. I looked for you for years, Sarah. I finally had to believe that I was dead." She finished it for him and her eyes filled. "I know. I let people believe that too eventually. It was easier than the truth." "What truth?" She shook her head, pulling her wrist gently free of his grip, glancing around at the strangers who had started to notice the two of them frozen together in the middle of the platform. "Not here," she whispered. "Then who did I write to?" Nathan pressed, lowering his voice, but not his intensity. "Who signed those letters, Clara Whitmore, for 3 months telling me about gardens and quiet winters and wanting a partner instead of a servant? Because I know that handwriting now. I know it because I used to get notes passed to me under the schoolhouse door in that same hand." Sarah's chin trembled. "That was never my real name?" "Then whose name is it?" "Nobody's," she said. "It's a name I made up. A name that doesn't carry debts or a dead husband or men looking for me. Clara Whitmore doesn't exist, Nathan. I made her up on a train 2 states from here, and I've been her for almost a year." Nathan stared at her, his jaw working 100 questions crowding behind his teeth all at once. "Men looking for you," he repeated slowly. "What men? Please." Her voice cracked. "Not on a train platform in front of half the town." A porter cleared his throat nearby, clearly listening, and Sarah flinched at the sound like she'd been struck. Nathan saw it, that flinch, and something in his chest twisted hard. Whatever had happened to her in 20 years, it had taught her to be afraid of being overheard. He picked up her bag from the platform boards. "Come on," he said, gentler now. "My wagon's out front." Sarah hesitated, looking at his outstretched hand, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to take it. "You're not angry?" she asked. "I don't even know what I am yet," Nathan admitted. "Give me the ride home to figure it out." She almost smiled at that. Almost. They walked to the wagon in silence. Nathan's mind spinning through 20 years of memory in the space of 100 yards. He remembered a skinny girl with scraped knees who used to race him down to the creek, who used to sneak him biscuits when his father forgot to feed him supper, who used to say, "Someday I'm going to leave this town and you're going to come with me," like it was a promise instead of a child's daydream. He remembered the morning he'd knocked on her door and found the house empty. Furniture gone, curtains gone, not even a note. He remembered asking everyone in town where the Miller family had gone, and nobody knowing or nobody willing to say. He remembered being 12 years old and standing at the creek for 6 straight days, certain she would come back, certain there had been some mistake. She never had, until now. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, and for a moment their hands touched, and both of them pulled back a half-second too fast, like they'd been burned. "Sarah," he said again, testing the name in his mouth like it might dissolve if he wasn't careful with it. "It's strange to hear it," she admitted. I haven't been Sarah in a long time. Why not? She looked out at the dusty street, at the mercantile and the saloon and the little white church at the end of the road, all of it achingly familiar and completely foreign at the same time. Because Sarah Miller has debts, she said quietly, and a dead husband, and men who would very much like to find her. Nathan snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. Then you'd better start telling me what kind of trouble I just brought home, he said. Sarah's hands twisted together in her lap. It's not that simple. Try me. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the town roll past the same buildings, mostly just older. Weathered a few new ones she didn't recognize. My husband was named Edward Prescott, she finally said. We were married 8 years. He worked for a land company out of Cheyenne, buying up parcels for railroad expansion. Good money for a while. Then 3 years ago he got sick his lungs, the doctor said, from working in the mines before the land company, and within 6 months he was gone. I'm sorry, Nathan said, and meant it. Don't be. Not for that part. Her voice hardened slightly. Because after he died, I started going through his papers, trying to understand what we owed, what we owned, what I was supposed to do next, and I found things I wasn't supposed to find. What things? Contracts, Sarah said. Forged deeds. Letters between Edward and his employer discussing land parcels that had been taken from families who never agreed to sell, families who couldn't read the papers they were signing, or who were told the land was worthless when it sat directly on a rail line. Nathan's hands tightened on the reins. Your husband stole land from people. My husband was told to, Sarah corrected, and there was old grief in her voice tangled up with something like shame. He wasn't a good man, Nathan, not by the end. But he wasn't the one who built the scheme. He worked for someone else. Someone with money and a name that opens doors in 3 territories. Who? Sarah's jaw tightened. It doesn't matter yet. It matters plenty. It matters, she said, meeting his eyes, when I decide it's safe to say it out loud. Not before. Nathan wanted to push. Every instinct in him wanted to pull the wagon to a stop and demand the whole truth right there in the middle of the road. But something in her face, that same braced, ready-to-run look from the platform, told him that pushing would only make her run again the way she'd run 20 years ago, without a word of goodbye. So instead he asked, why keep the papers if they're dangerous to have? Because they're the only proof that those families were cheated, Sarah said. And because the man who wants them back has already sent people looking for me twice. If I burn them, I have nothing to protect myself with. If I keep them, I have a target on my back, but at least I have a card to play. And you came all the way out here, Nathan said slowly, understanding dawning, under a false name to marry a stranger because you needed to disappear. Sarah didn't answer right away. I came out here, she finally said, because a rancher wrote me letters that made me believe there might still be a version of my life that wasn't about running. I didn't know that rancher was you. I swear to you, Nathan, I had no idea. Would it have mattered if you'd known? Her eyes glistened. It would have mattered so much I might never have gotten on that train, because I don't deserve to walk back into your life carrying all of this. You should have gotten Clara Whitmore, a woman with no past, no danger following her. Instead, you got Sarah Miller and everything that comes with her. Nathan pulled the wagon to a stop at the edge of town, right where the road split toward the ranch, and turned to look at her fully, for the first time since the platform. 20 years ago, he said, I lost you because nobody gave either one of us a choice. Your father made a decision in the middle of the night, and you were just a child who had to go along with it. I spent years being angry at a 12-year-old girl for something she had no control over. It took me a long time to understand that. Nathan, I'm not finished. His voice was steady, though his hands weren't. I don't know what kind of man is looking for you, or what kind of danger you've dragged into my life along with those papers. But I know that the girl who used to sneak me biscuits and drag me down to the creek grew up into a woman who kept proof of a crime instead of burning it and walking away clean because she couldn't stand the thought of those families never getting justice. That's not a coward hiding from trouble. That's the bravest thing I've heard in years. Sarah's composure finally broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth like she could hold the sob in if she just pushed hard enough. "You don't know what you're agreeing to," she whispered. "The man behind this, Nathan, he's not someone who gives up. If he finds out where I am, then we'll deal with that when it happens," Nathan said. "Right now you've had a train ride, a shock, and 20 years of grief dumped on you in the space of 10 minutes. Let's get you home first." Home. The word seemed to hit her harder than anything else he'd said. Her breath caught, and for a second she just looked at him like she was trying to figure out if he meant it or if it was just a word people said. "Okay," she finally whispered. Home. Nathan snapped the reins again, and the wagon rolled on toward the ranch, past fields gone gold in the late afternoon light, past fence lines Nathan had built board by board with his own 2 hands. Neither of them spoke for a while. Sarah watched the land roll by, and Nathan watched her out of the corner of his eye, still trying to reconcile the girl in his memory with the woman sitting beside him now. Quieter, harder around the edges, carrying weight he couldn't fully see yet. "Tell me something true," Nathan finally said. "Something that isn't about debts or dangerous men. Just something true about you now." Sarah thought about it for a long moment. "I still can't sleep with a closed door," she said. "Ever since everything with Edward's employer started, I need to be able to see an exit, even in my own house." Nathan absorbed that quietly. "The room I set up for you has a window that opens easy and a door that doesn't stick. I'll make sure it stays that way." Something in Sarah's shoulders loosened just slightly, like a held breath finally released. "Tell me something true about you," she said. "I still can't walk past that creek without thinking of you," Nathan admitted. 20 years and I never once caught a fish there without hearing your voice in my head telling me I was doing it wrong." Sarah let out a small, surprised laugh, the first real sound of joy Nathan had heard from her since the platform. "I probably was right," she said. "You always held the line too tight. Some things don't change." "No," she agreed softly, looking at him now instead of the passing fields. "I suppose they don't." The ranch came into view as the sun started sliding toward the western hills. The plank house Nathan had built, the barn, the split-rail fences holding in a small herd of cattle that lifted their heads lazily to watch the wagon roll past. A woman in her 50s stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, squinting against the sun. "That's Margaret," Nathan said. "She's kept this place running since my mother passed. Doesn't miss a thing, so don't try lying to her about anything ever. She'll know before you finish the sentence." Margaret Ellis came down the porch steps as the wagon pulled up, her sharp eyes moving immediately from Nathan to Sarah and back again, reading something in the air between them that made her slow her pace. "Well," Margaret said, planting her hands on her hips, "you two look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," Nathan said, climbing down. Margaret's gaze fixed on Sarah as Nathan helped her from the wagon. "You're paler than milk, honey. Sit down before you fall down." She turned her sharp eyes on Nathan. "What in heaven's name happened at that depot?" "I'll explain everything tonight," Nathan said. "Right now she needs food and rest, not an interrogation." Margaret's eyebrows climbed, but she didn't push, only muttered something about men never explaining anything properly and herded Sarah gently toward the house. Inside the house smelled like fresh bread and wood smoke. Sarah stood in the front room for a long moment, just looking around at the simple furniture, the neat shelves, the complete absence of anything decorative or soft. "You live like a man who's never planning to stay anywhere long," she observed. Nathan, standing in this doorway, felt oddly exposed by the comment. "I built it to last. Never thought much about making it pretty." "It's not about pretty," Sarah said. "It's about whether a place feels like somebody lives here or whether somebody's just passing through their own life." Margaret, overhearing from the kitchen doorway, snorted. "Told him that myself for 10 years. Boy's stubborn as a mule." "I'm standing right here," Nathan said. "We know," Margaret said sweetly and disappeared back into the kitchen to start supper. That evening the three of them sat at the long wooden table, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Nathan ate a meal that didn't feel like a chore to get through. Margaret peppered Sarah with careful questions: where she was from, what she liked to cook, whether she rode horses, and Sarah answered most of them honestly, carefully avoiding anything about Edward or the papers, or the man who was looking for her. Nathan watched her navigate the conversation, like a woman walking across thin ice, testing each board before putting her full weight on it. After supper, when Margaret retired to her small room off the kitchen, Nathan walked Sarah down the hall to the room he'd prepared for her, small, plain, but clean, with a window that looked out over the west pasture and a door that swung easily on its hinges. "This is yours," he said, "for as long as you want it to be." Sarah stood in the doorway looking at the narrow bed, the wash basin, the single chair by the window, and something in her face crumpled. "I haven't had a room of my own in 3 years, she admitted. "Not one where I didn't have to sleep with a bag packed by the door just in case." "You don't have to do that here." "You don't know that," Sarah said quietly. "You don't know what's coming." "Then tell me." She was quiet for a long time, her hand resting on the doorframe, like she needed something solid to hold on to. "His name is Harold Vane," she finally said. The name landed in the hallway like a stone dropped into still water. He was Edward's employer. He built half his fortune buying land under false pretenses across 3 territories, and he spent the last year making sure nobody with proof of it stays alive long enough to talk. 2 men who worked with Edward are dead. 1 disappeared. "I have documents that would end him, Nathan, and he knows I have them, and he will not stop looking until he finds me." Nathan felt something cold settle low in his stomach. "And you brought that here." "I told you I shouldn't have come," Sarah said, tears rising again. "I told you on the platform. I can leave in the morning, Nathan. I can disappear again. I've done it before." "Stop." Nathan's voice was firm, though his heart was pounding hard enough that he could feel it in his throat. "You're not leaving. Not tonight. Not tomorrow morning. Not because you're scared of what you might bring down on this ranch. You don't understand what kind of man he is." "Then I'll learn," Nathan said. "But I already lost you once because nobody gave either one of us a say in it. I'm not standing by and watching you vanish a second time just because you've decided I'm safer without you." Sarah searched his face for a long moment, like she was trying to find the lie in it, and couldn't. 20 years, she whispered, "and you still fight for people the same way." "Some things don't change," Nathan said again, softer this time. She almost smiled, but it faded fast, replaced by something heavier. "Get some sleep," Nathan said. "We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." He turned to go, but her voice stopped him at the end of the hall. "Nathan?" He turned back. "Thank you," she said, "for not sending me back on that train." "I'd never do that," he said. "Not to you, not twice." She shut the door softly behind her, and Nathan stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the quiet click of the latch, thinking about the word twice and how much weight it carried between them now. He didn't sleep well that night. Every time the wind picked up outside, every time a board creaked in the old house settling, his mind went straight to a name he'd never heard until an hour ago, Harold Vane, and a fear he couldn't yet put a shape to. Around midnight, he got up, pulled on his boots, and walked out onto the porch, needing the cold air to clear his head. That's when he saw it. A rider far off at the edge of the property line, sitting motionless on his horse in the moonlight, watching the house. Nathan's hand went instinctively to the doorframe behind him, where he kept a rifle leaned within reach. The rider didn't move, didn't approach, just sat there still as a photograph for nearly a full minute. Then slowly he turned his horse and rode off into the dark. Nathan stood on the porch a long time after the sound of hoofbeats faded, his heart hammering, staring at the empty tree line where the stranger had disappeared. He didn't wake Sarah to tell her, not yet. But he knew standing there in the cold Wyoming night that whatever peace they'd found at that supper table tonight was already running out of time. Nathan didn't go back inside. He stood on that porch until the cold worked all the way into his bones, rifle within reach, eyes fixed on the tree line where the rider had vanished, waiting to see if he'd come back. He didn't, but sleep never came either. By the time the sky started turning gray in the east, Nathan had made a decision. He wasn't going to hide what he'd seen. Whatever kind of man he was, stubborn, slow to trust, more comfortable with cattle than conversation. He wasn't going to be the kind of man who kept secrets from the woman sleeping down the hall. Not after everything secrets had already cost the two of them. He found Sarah in this kitchen before Margaret even had the stove going, standing at the window with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, staring out at the pasture like she already knew something was wrong. "You didn't sleep," Nathan said. "Neither did you." She turned, and her eyes went straight to the dark circles under his. What happened? He didn't see the point in softening it. There was a rider out past the tree line last night, sitting his horse, just watching the house. Didn't come closer. Didn't leave when I stepped onto the porch. Just sat there a while, then rode off. The coffee cup shook in Sarah's hand. What did he look like? Too dark to tell. Big man from what I could make out. Rode a gray horse. Sarah set the cup down before she dropped it. That could be anyone, she said, but her voice had gone thin and fast, the way people talk, when they're trying to convince themselves of something they don't believe. Could be, Nathan agreed. Or it could be somebody Harold Vane sent to find out if the rumors are true. What rumors? That a woman got off the train yesterday and rode out to Coal Valley Ranch. Nathan crossed his arms. Sarah, this is a small town. By supper last night, half of Red Hollow already knew Nathan Cole's mail-order bride arrived on the afternoon train. That's not the kind of thing that stays quiet, especially if somebody's been asking around for a woman traveling alone. Sarah's hand pressed flat against her stomach, like she might be sick. I need to leave, she said. Today, before he... No. Nathan, you don't understand what he does to people who get in his way. Then explain it to me instead of running from it. Nathan's voice came out harder than he intended, and he watched her flinch, and he hated himself a little for it, but he didn't take it back. You've been running for a year, Sarah. Alone. With no one watching your back. Tell me honestly, has running kept you safe, or has it just kept you exhausted and scared in a new town every few months? Sarah's jaw tightened, but she didn't answer because they both already knew. I have a ranch full of hired men, Nathan said. I have a rifle I know how to use. I have neighbors who'll come running if trouble shows up, because that's how this town works, whatever else people say about it. You are not facing this alone anymore. That ends today. You don't even know what you're offering to fight, Sarah whispered. Then sit down, Nathan said, pulling out a chair, and tell me everything, all of it. No more half-truths on wagon rides. I need the whole thing, Sarah, or I can't protect you from it. For a long moment, Sarah just stood there, torn between 20 years of instinct that told her to run and something new, something that looked almost like hope that told her maybe for the first time she didn't have to. She sat down. His full name is Harold Vane, she began, voice low. He owns Vane Land and Development out of Cheyenne. On paper, it's a legitimate company. Buys parcels, sells them to the railroad at a profit when the lines expand. Nothing illegal about any of that. But for the last 6 years at least, he's been forging deeds, targeting families who can't read well or don't understand territorial land law or who owe money and are desperate enough to sign anything put in front of them. He has men lawyers, surveyors, even a judge in Laramie County, I believe, who make sure the paperwork holds up if anyone ever questions it. And your husband worked for him. Sarah's hands twisted together on the table. Edward handled the negotiations. He was good at it, good at making people trust him, good at making bad deals sound generous. I didn't know Nathan, not for years. I thought we had money because Edward was simply talented at his work. When did you find out? After he died. Going through his papers to understand our debts, I found a ledger, names of families, amounts paid far below actual value next to notes about which families had been difficult and needed extra pressure. I found letters between Edward and Vane discussing how to handle a family in Sweetwater County who refused to sign. 3 weeks after that letter, their barn burned down. They signed the following week. Nathan felt something cold and furious settle behind his ribs. You have proof of that. I have the ledger. I have 11 letters. I have 2 forged deeds with Vane's signature on documents he'd deny ever seeing. Sarah looked up at him. It's enough to end him, Nathan. Prison most likely for both fraud and for whatever happened to that barn if a prosecutor is willing to dig. That's why he wants it back so badly, he's willing to have people watched, followed, and in at least 2 cases killed. Killed. A man named Otis Graham worked with Edward on 3 different deals, Sarah said, her voice dropping even further. He started drinking heavy after Edward died, talking too loud in saloons about what he knew. Found dead at the bottom of a ravine 8 months ago. Officially, his horse spooked and he fell. I don't believe that for a single second. Nathan sat back in his chair, jaw working, trying to fit this new shape of danger into a world that 24 hours ago had only contained cattle prices and fence repairs. And the second man disappeared, Sarah said. Simply gone. His family says he went west to find work. I think he's dead too, or running exactly like I've been running. The kitchen door creaked, and both of them jumped like they'd been caught at something. Margaret stood in the doorway, in her nightclothes hair, still in its sleeping braid, eyes sharp, despite the early hour. I heard the word killed from down the hall, Margaret said flatly. So either somebody better start explaining, or I'm going to assume the worst and start loading the shotgun myself. Nathan looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Margaret, and something passed between the 2 women, a silent negotiation woman to woman about how much truth a person could be trusted with. Sit down, Margaret, Sarah finally said. You should hear this too. If trouble's coming to this ranch, you deserve to know why. By the time the sun was fully up, Margaret had heard the whole story, and her face had gone through every shade of shock, fury, and grim resolve that Nathan's own had traveled the night before. Well, Margaret said, finally standing and smoothing her apron like she was preparing for battle instead of breakfast. I've buried a husband and outlived 2 brothers who thought they could push me around. I am not about to let some crooked land baron scare a good woman out of this house. Not on my watch. Despite everything, Sarah let out a small surprised laugh. You don't even know me, she said. I know you kept proof of a crime instead of burning it for your own safety, Margaret said. I know you married a man young and grieved him honest even after finding out what he was. And I know Nathan hasn't looked this alive in 10 years, not since before his mother passed. That's plenty for me to decide whose side I'm on. Sarah's eyes filled again, and this time she didn't try to hide it. That right there was the first mini-climax of many that day. Not danger, not violence, just a woman who had spent a year believing she was entirely alone in the world, discovering that 2 strangers had decided within 24 hours to stand beside her anyway. But the peace didn't last. Around midday, one of Nathan's hired hands, a young man named Toby, came riding in fast from the direction of town, kicking up dust his horse lathered. Mr. Cole, he shouted, swinging down before the horse had even fully stopped. There's a man in town asking questions. At the mercantile, at the saloon, even stopped by the sheriff's office. Asking about a woman traveling alone matching a description. Brown hair, blue eyes, about 30. Says he's looking for his sister. Sarah, standing on the porch, went white as bone. Did he give a name? Nathan asked, already moving toward the barn. Said his name was Del Ashford, Toby said. But Mr. Whitfield at the mercantile said something about him didn't sit right. Said the man's clothes were too fine for someone claiming to be a poor rancher's brother looking for family. Said he asked more questions about where than how she's doing, if you understand my meaning. Nathan's blood went cold and quiet, in a way that scared him more than shouting would have. Sarah, he said. Does the name Del Ashford mean anything to you? She shook her head slowly. No, but that doesn't mean anything. Vane wouldn't send someone using his own real name. Then we assume it's him, Nathan said. Or one of his. I told you, Sarah said, voice shaking. I told you this would happen, and I told you we'd deal with it when it did. Nathan turned to Toby. I want you to ride back into town quiet and just watch. Don't ask questions. Don't draw attention. Find out where this Ashford is staying and how long he plans to be around. Can you do that? Toby nodded, eager, despite the danger the way young men on ranches always were, when finally handed something that mattered. And Toby, Nathan added. If he asks about the ranch, about me, about anyone living here, you know nothing. Understand?" "Yes, sir." Toby rode off in a fresh cloud of dust, and Nathan turned back to find Sarah gripping the porch rail so hard her knuckles had gone white. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said. "I bring this to your door in less than a day." "You didn't bring it," Nathan said. "Vane brought it. There's a difference, and I need you to understand that difference, because I am not going to spend the next however many days watching you blame yourself for another man's crimes." "Nathan, no." He stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head up to hold his eyes. "You survived a husband who lied to you for years. You survived finding out the truth and choosing to keep proof instead of burning it and disappearing clean. You survived running alone for a year with nobody watching your back. You are the least guilty person in this entire situation, and I need you to hear that, even if you don't believe it yet." Sarah's breath caught, and for one long moment, standing there on the porch with the midday sun beating down and danger somewhere in town, wearing another man's name. Something passed between them that had nothing to do with fear at all. Nathan's hand came up almost without his permission and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, the same nervous gesture he'd watched her make on the platform, except this time his fingers did it for her. Sarah went very still. "Nathan," she whispered. "I know," he said quietly. "It's too soon. It's too much all at once. I'm not asking for anything. He stopped, swallowed hard. "I just needed you to know I meant every word." Sarah's hand came up and covered his where it rested against her cheek, and for a moment neither of them moved. 20 years, and a stranger's danger, and an entire lifetime of separate grief folding down into one small quiet touch. Then from inside the house, Margaret's voice rang out. "If you two are going to stand there making eyes at each other, at least come inside and eat something. I didn't fry up eggs for the chickens to enjoy the smell." The moment broke and both of them laughed. Real laughter surprised out of them despite everything, and Sarah wiped quickly at her eyes before following Nathan inside. That laughter didn't last long. Toby returned just before sundown, his horse blown hard, his young face tight with worry that hadn't been there that morning. "He's staying at the boarding house on 5th Street, Toby reported, still catching his breath. "Paid for a full week up front in cash, which the owner said was unusual. And Mr. Cole, he asked Mr. Whitfield at the Mercantile whether Cole Valley Ranch had hired any new domestic help recently. Said it real casual, like he already suspected the answer." Nathan's stomach dropped. "He knows," Sarah whispered. "He already knows I'm here." "We don't know that for certain," Nathan said, though his voice lacked conviction even to his own ears. "He paid for a week, Nathan. Men like that don't waste money sitting around town for no reason. He's confirming a location before he does something about it." That night, supper was a tense, quiet affair. Margaret kept glancing at the windows. Nathan kept his rifle leaned against the wall within arm's reach, something he'd never once done at his own supper table in 10 years of living alone. After the dishes were cleared, Sarah found Nathan out by the barn, checking the locks on the tack room out of nervous habit more than necessity. "I keep thinking about something," she said, arms wrapped around herself against the evening chill. 20 years ago, my family disappeared in the night because my father was running from debts. I hated him for years for doing that to me, pulling me away from the only home and the only friend I ever had without so much as a warning." "Sarah, let me finish." She took a breath. "And now here I am, doing the same thing, running, disappearing, dragging danger behind me into someone else's life. I spent 20 years angry at my father, and now I understand him better than I ever wanted to." "You're not your father," Nathan said firmly. "Your father ran from debts he created through his own poor choices. You're running from a crime someone else committed against innocent families. That is not the same thing, and I won't let you convince yourself it is." "How do you know the difference so clearly?" "Because I spent 20 years hating a little girl for something that was never her fault," Nathan said. "I'm not making that mistake twice with anyone." Sarah's eyes glistened in the lantern light. "You keep saying things like that, and I don't know what to do with them." "You don't have to do anything with them," Nathan said. "Just let them be true." The following days settled into a strange, watchful rhythm, ranch work continuing as it always had. Sarah slowly learning the household Margaret, teaching her which hens laid best, and how Nathan liked his coffee. All of it happening under a low hum of danger that never quite went away. Toby reported back twice more that week. Del Ashford, if that was even his real name, remained in town, asking careful casual questions, never quite direct enough to draw suspicion from anyone but the most watchful observers, but persistent enough that it was clear he wasn't simply passing through. On the third day, Sarah found herself in the kitchen with Margaret hands deep in bread dough when Margaret asked the question Sarah had been dreading since the platform. "You love him," Margaret said. Not a question. A statement delivered as casually as if she'd commented on the weather. Sarah's hands stilled in the dough. "It's complicated. Everything worth having is." Margaret didn't look up from her own work. "But I've watched that boy for 10 years ever since his mother passed, and I've never once seen him look at anything. Not a horse, not a harvest, not a single living soul, the way he looked at you stepping off that train. We were children together, Margaret, 20 years ago. I don't even know the man he's become." "Then get to know him," Margaret said simply. "Isn't that easier than pretending you don't already feel something?" Sarah didn't have an answer for that, because Margaret was right, and both of them knew it. That evening, Nathan found her sitting alone on the porch steps, watching the sun bleed orange and pink across the western hills. And something about the sight of her sitting there quiet, thoughtful, finally still after days of tension, made his chest ache in a way he wasn't fully prepared for. "Room for one more?" he asked. Sarah shifted over without a word, and he sat down beside her close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I keep thinking about something you said," Sarah admitted after a while, "that you're learning to love the woman I've become, not just remembering the girl I used to be." "I meant it. I believe you." She turned to look at him. "But I need you to understand something too. The girl you remember from the creek, she trusted easily. She believed people were mostly good, mostly honest. That girl is gone, Nathan. 8 years of marriage to a man who lied to me every single day, and a year of running from a man who's had people killed took that trust apart piece by piece." "I don't need the girl from the creek," Nathan said quietly. "I told you that already." "I know. But I need you to know what you're actually getting instead. A woman who checks every door twice, who can't sleep without knowing where the exit is, who's going to flinch at loud noises for reasons that have nothing to do with you and everything to do with 3 years of learning not to trust anyone who says they'll protect her." Nathan reached over and took her hand, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. "Then I'll learn all of that too," he said. "The flinching, the checked doors, all of it. Because that's not a flaw I'm agreeing to overlook, Sarah. That's just part of who you are now, and I already told you I'm not here for who you used to be." Sarah's fingers tightened around his. 20 years, she whispered. "And you're still the only person who's ever made me believe that might actually be true." For a moment, sitting there in the fading light, it felt almost possible to forget that somewhere in town, a man calling himself Del Ashford was quietly confirming exactly where she could be found. Almost. The illusion of peace shattered 4 days later. Nathan was out repairing fence along the north pasture when Toby came riding hard again, and one look at the boy's face told Nathan this wasn't another routine report. "He's gone," Toby said, breathless. "Ashford. Checked out of the boarding house this morning. Owner said he settled his bill, said he was heading back to Cheyenne." Relief flickered through Nathan for exactly 1 second before Toby kept talking. "But Mr. Cole, I followed a ways out of town just to be sure, like you said. He didn't take the Cheyenne road. He took the North Trail, the one that circles up behind your property line." Nathan's blood turned to ice. "He's not leaving," Nathan said. "He's repositioning." He rode back to the house faster than he'd ridden anywhere in years, and found Sarah in the garden with Margaret, both women looking up in alarm as he came thundering into the yard. "Get inside," he said, swinging down before his horse had fully stopped. "Now, both of you." "Nathan, what?" "Ashford didn't leave for Cheyenne. He's circling around behind the property. Inside now and stay away from the windows." The fear that crossed Sarah's face in that instant was the most naked thing Nathan had seen from her, yet not the careful, controlled anxiety she'd been managing all week, but pure animal terror. "He's found me," she whispered. "We don't know that for certain," Nathan said, already checking the rifle, already thinking through the layout of his own land, with the sharp, fast calculation of a man preparing for a fight he'd never wanted. "But we're not taking chances. Margaret, get Sarah into the back room, keep the shotgun close. I'm going to check the property line." "You're not going out there alone," Sarah said, grabbing his arm. "I'm not letting anyone get close enough to this house to hurt either one of you," Nathan said. "That's not up for discussion." "Nathan, please." His voice cracked just slightly, all his careful steadiness slipping for just a moment. "Please let me do this. I already lost you once because I didn't have a say in what happened. Let me have a say now." Sarah's eyes filled, but she nodded and released his arm. Nathan rode the property line as the sun began sinking rifle across his saddle, eyes scanning every tree line, every shadow, every place a man could hide and watch a house full of people who had no idea how much danger had just circled back around them. He found nothing. No rider, no fresh tracks beyond what his own cattle had made. No sign at all that anyone had come anywhere near the house. But as darkness fell and he turned his horse back toward home, he caught sight of something in the mud near the eastern fence line, a boot print fresh far larger than any of his own hired hands wore, and beside it the clear indent of a horse having stood still for a long while. Someone had been there, watching, and had slipped away again before Nathan ever got close. He rode back to the house in the full dark heart pounding and found Sarah waiting on the porch despite Margaret's protests, unable to sit still inside while he was out there searching. "Well?" she asked the moment he swung down from his horse. Nathan hesitated, weighing whether to lie to spare her one more night of fear. He decided against it. No more secrets, not between them. "Someone was on the eastern fence line," he said. "Recently. Boot print horse tracks. Whoever it was, they were gone before I got there." Sarah's legs seemed to give slightly, and Nathan caught her before she fully swayed, pulling her against his chest without thinking, and for a long moment she simply stood there, shaking, held against him, in the cold, dark yard. "I can't keep doing this," she whispered against his shirt. "I can't keep bringing this fear into every place I try to call home." "You're not doing anything," Nathan said fiercely, arms tightening around her. "A criminal is hunting proof of his own crimes. That's not your fault, Sarah, and I will say that to you every single day until you believe it. What if he hurts you, or Margaret, because of me? Then we'll make sure he doesn't get the chance," Nathan said. "Tomorrow I'm riding into town. I'm talking to the sheriff. And I'm sending a telegram to a lawyer I know in Cheyenne, someone who might know how to move against a man like Vane without putting you directly in the path of it. Nathan, if you go digging into this, you become a target too." "I already am one," Nathan said simply. "The moment you stepped off that train, I became part of this. I'd rather fight it standing beside you than pretend I can keep you safe by staying out of it." Sarah pulled back just enough to look up at him, tears tracking silently down her face in the moonlight. 20 years ago," she said, "I used to think you were the bravest boy I'd ever known. Jumping off the highest rock into the creek, standing up to boys twice your size when they made fun of my family's clothes. I remember." "I think you might be an even braver man," she whispered. Nathan didn't trust himself to answer that with words. Instead, slowly giving her every chance in the world to step back, he lowered his head, and Sarah rose up to meet him. And for one suspended moment in the cold, dark yard, 20 years of separation dissolved into something that felt finally like coming home. The kiss was soft, careful, full of 2 decades of unspoken longing neither of them had fully admitted to themselves until that exact moment. When they finally broke apart, Sarah let out a small, shaky laugh, pressing her forehead against his chest. "That's not exactly how I imagined tonight going," she admitted. "Which part?" Nathan asked, voice rough. "The mysterious rider on the fence line or this?" "Definitely this," Sarah said, and this time her laugh came easier, real cutting through some of the fear that had gripped the yard just minutes before. But even as they stood there wrapped around each other in the dark, Nathan's eyes kept drifting past her shoulder, out toward the tree line, toward the place where a man's boot print sat, pressed into the mud like a promise of trouble still to come. Whatever peace this moment offered, he knew it was borrowed. They walked back inside together, and Nathan bolted every door and window in the house that night, checking each one twice, while Margaret sat up with the shotgun across her lap, and Sarah lay awake in the small room with the easy swinging door, listening to every creak of the old house, and wondering how long it would be before Harold Vane's patience finally ran out. The telegram Nathan sent to Cheyenne the next morning was simple, careful, deliberately vague, in case it fell into the wrong hands. Need legal counsel regarding land fraud matter. Urgent. Discretion required. Will pay well for quick response. N. Cole, Red Hollow. He sent it and rode home with a knot of dread sitting heavy in his stomach, aware that he'd just pulled a thread that might unravel far more than he could yet imagine. 3 days passed with no reply and no further sign of Ashford, and the strange quiet stretched everyone's nerves tighter instead of looser, the way silence before a storm always did. It was Margaret, of all people, who finally broke the tension building in the house, marching into the front room one evening with her hands on her hips and an expression that brooked no argument. "I've had about enough of everyone tiptoeing around this house like ghosts," she announced. "Sarah, you've barely eaten in 2 days. Nathan, you've checked those door locks so many times I'm surprised the hinges haven't worn clean off. We are going to sit down, the three of us, and have a proper supper, and talk about something that isn't Harold Vane for one single evening. I refuse to let that man ruin every meal in this house before he's even shown his face." Despite everything, Sarah smiled a real unguarded smile, the first Nathan had seen from her in days. "Margaret's right," she said. "I've spent a year letting fear run every part of my life. I don't want to spend tonight doing the same thing." So they did exactly that. Margaret told stories about Nathan as a boy, humiliating ones, mostly about a 10-year-old who'd once tried to ride a bull calf on a dare and ended up in the creek for his trouble, and Sarah laughed harder than she had in longer than she could remember, and for a few precious hours, the ranch felt like nothing more than what it was supposed to be, a home full of people who cared about each other untouched by outside danger. It was well after dark when the sound of hoofbeats came pounding up the road, fast and urgent, and every ounce of warmth in the room drained away in an instant. Nathan was on his feet immediately, rifle in hand, moving to the window. "It's Toby," he said, relief cutting through the tension, though only partially. "But he's riding like the devil's behind him." He met the boy in the yard, Sarah and Margaret close behind, despite his instructions to stay back. "Mr. Cole?" Toby gasped, nearly falling off his horse in his hurry to dismount. "You need to see this. Sheriff Coburn found something out past the old Miller property this afternoon. Says it concerns the woman staying out here." Sarah went rigid at the mention of her family's old land. "What did he find?" Nathan asked. Toby held out a folded piece of paper, hands shaking. "A note," he said, "pinned to a tree right at the edge of your property line. Sheriff figured you should see it before word got around town." Nathan unfolded the paper with hands that weren't entirely steady, and Sarah pressed close against his side to read it too. And what was written there in harsh, deliberate handwriting drained every last trace of color from both their faces. "I know she's there. I know what she's carrying. She has until the end of the month to return what belongs to me, or I stop being patient. H.V." The paper trembled in Nathan's grip. "He signed it," Sarah whispered, horror washing over her face. "He actually signed it. He's not even trying to hide anymore." "That means he's confident," Nathan said grimly. "Confident enough that he doesn't think anyone in this town has the power to stop him." "What do we do?" Sarah's voice had gone thin with fear. Nathan folded the note carefully, jaw set with a hard, cold resolve that Sarah had not yet seen from him. "We stop being patient too," he said. Nathan didn't sleep that night either. He sat at the kitchen table until the candle burned down to a stub, the note from Harold Vane spread flat in front of him, reading it over and over, like the words might rearrange themselves into something less dangerous if he just looked hard enough. Sarah found him there past midnight, still fully dressed, rifle leaned against the table leg within easy reach. "You should be sleeping," she said softly. "So should you." "I can't." She sat down across from him, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that handwriting. He's never signed anything before, Nathan. Not once in a year of being hunted. That note means something's changed." "It means he's done waiting," Nathan said. "And it means he's confident nobody in Red Hollow can touch him." "Can they?" Nathan didn't answer right away because he didn't have an honest answer that wouldn't frighten her further. "Sheriff Coburn's a good man," he finally said. "But he's one man with a small badge in a small town, and Vane's got money enough to buy judges in 3 territories according to what you told me. I don't know if Coburn alone is enough." "Then what do we do?" Nathan reached across the table and took her hand. "Tomorrow we go see him together. You tell him everything, the ledger, the letters, the deeds, all of it. And I send another telegram to Cheyenne, and this time I don't wait politely for a reply. I ride there myself if I have to." Sarah's fingers tightened around his. "And if the lawyer won't help, if nobody in this territory is willing to stand against a man with Vane's money, then we find someone who will," Nathan said. "Because I am not spending the rest of my life watching you flinch at every hoofbeat on the road." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her tired eyes. "20 years ago," she said quietly, "I used to think nothing could scare you. Not bulls, not bullies, not my father's temper when he caught us at the creek past supper. I used to think you were fearless. I was a child who didn't understand what real danger looked like," Nathan said. "I understand it now, and I'm still not backing away from this." They rode into town together the next morning. Sarah dressed plainly, hair pulled back tight, doing everything she could to look like a woman with nothing to hide, though her hands never fully stopped trembling the entire ride. Sheriff Coburn's office sat at the end of the main street, a squat brick building with a single barred window and a flag hanging limp in the windless morning. Coburn himself was a heavy-set man in his 50s, gray-mustached with the tired, watchful eyes of a lawman who'd seen more trouble in a small town than most people expected. He listened to Sarah's story without interrupting, once his expression growing grimmer with every detail. The forged deeds, the burned barn in Sweetwater County, Otis Graham's death at the bottom of a ravine, the note pinned to a tree on Nathan's own property. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and rubbed a hand over his face. "Miss Miller," he said slowly, "I want to help you. I do. But I need to be straight with you about something." "What?" Sarah asked, dread already creeping into her voice. "Harold Vane isn't just wealthy," Coburn said. "He's connected. I made some inquiries of my own quiet-like after I found that note. Word is, he's got relationships with at least 1 circuit judge and 2 federal land officials. If I arrest a man like that on the word of a widow with no living witnesses and a stack of papers he'll claim are forged themselves, he'll have me removed from this office inside a month and you'll be worse off than when you started." "So you're saying there's nothing you can do," Nathan said, jaw tight. "I'm saying I need more than a ledger and some letters," Coburn said. "I need a witness willing to testify. I need someone with standing who'll back your claims in front of a judge who isn't in Vane's pocket. And frankly, Miss Miller, I need you to still be alive when the time comes to testify. Which means, right now, the smartest thing I can do for you is quietly increase patrols near the coal ranch and pray this Ashford fellow doesn't come back." Sarah's face fell the last of her hope, draining visibly away. "That's not enough," she whispered. "I know it isn't," Coburn admitted. "But it's what I've got today. Give me time and I'll find you more." "Time is exactly what we might not have," Nathan said grimly, and Coburn had no answer for that either. They rode home in heavy silence, the weight of the sheriff's honesty settling over both of them like a physical thing. "I told you," Sarah finally said, staring straight ahead at the road. "I told you this wasn't a fight anyone could just walk into and win easily." "I never said it would be easy," Nathan said. "I said I wasn't walking away from it." "Nathan." "I mean it, Sarah." She turned to look at him, and something in her face had gone hard. Resolved, frightened in a way that Nathan hadn't seen from her yet. Not the fear of a woman being hunted, but the fear of a woman who loved someone and was terrified of what that love might cost him. "Maybe I should leave," she said quietly. "Take the papers. Go somewhere far from here. Somewhere Vane has no connections at all. Leave before he decides the ranch itself is a target worth burning to the ground to get what he wants." Nathan pulled the wagon to a hard stop in the middle of the road. "Say that again," he said, voice low and dangerous in a way she'd never heard from him. "Nathan?" "Say it again, Sarah. Tell me you're planning to disappear on me a second time." Her eyes filled instantly. "I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to protect you and Margaret and everyone on that ranch from a man who has already killed people over far less than what I'm carrying, and I'm trying to tell you." Nathan said, voice cracking with an intensity that surprised even him. "That losing you once nearly broke something in me that took 20 years to even partially heal. If you vanish again, if I wake up one morning and find your room empty, no note, no goodbye exactly like your family did to me when I was 12 years old, I don't know what that would do to me. I genuinely don't know if I'd survive it a second time." Sarah stared at him, tears spilling freely now, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wagon sitting motionless in the middle of the empty road. "That's not fair," she finally whispered. "Using that against me." "It's not a tactic," Nathan said gentler now, reaching over to wipe a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "It's the truth. I need you to understand what leaving would actually cost before you convince yourself it's the noble thing to do." Sarah leaned into his hand, closing her eyes. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not of dying. I made peace with that risk a long time ago. I'm scared of what happens to you and to Margaret and to this whole town because I chose to stay instead of run." "Then let's stop being scared alone," Nathan said. "Let's be scared together and fight anyway." Sarah let out a shaky breath, something between a laugh and a sob. "You make it sound almost reasonable." "It's not reasonable at all," Nathan admitted. "But it's what I want. Is it what you want?" For a long moment Sarah didn't answer, staring out at the wide Wyoming sky, at the mountains in the far distance, at the life she'd never let herself imagine having again after Edward died. "Yes," she finally whispered. "God help me, yes." Nathan kissed her, then, right there in the middle of the empty road, slow and certain. And when they finally broke apart, some of the fear had cleared from Sarah's eyes, replaced by something that looked almost like resolve. They rode the rest of the way home in a silence that felt different now, not heavy with dread, but steady with purpose. That resolve was tested faster than either of them expected. 3 days later, Nathan rode into town for supplies and returned to find the atmosphere on Main Street had shifted in a way that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Conversation stopped as he passed. Mrs. Halloway from the dress shop crossed the street rather than greet him. Old Wilkins outside the feed store wouldn't meet his eyes. He found Sheriff Coburn waiting for him outside the Mercantile Expression grim. "You need to hear this from me before you hear it secondhand," Coburn said. "Hear what?" "Man came through town yesterday well-dressed, calling himself a business associate of the late Edward Prescott. Told anyone who'd listen that Prescott's widow, your Sarah, was wanted for questioning back in Cheyenne. Said something about missing company funds. Said she'd fled with documents that didn't belong to her, and that decent folks ought to be cautious about harboring a woman with that kind of trouble following her." Nathan felt his hands curl into fists. That's a lie. Vane's spreading a story to turn the town against her before he even has to lift a finger himself. "I figured as much," Coburn said. "But knowing it and proving it are different things, and right now half this town's heard that story, and none of them have heard yours." By that evening, the whispers had reached the ranch itself. Toby reported it first awkward and apologetic, relaying gossip he'd overheard at the saloon about the rancher's mail-order bride who was secretly a thief on the run from her dead husband's business partners. Sarah took the news with a stillness that worried Nathan more than tears would have. "This is exactly how it starts," she said quietly, sitting at the kitchen table that night, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, gone cold. "This is how he did it to the families whose land he stole. First, he makes them look like liars or fools or criminals themselves. Then when something happens to them, nobody in town is inclined to ask too many questions because everyone already believes they deserved it. Nobody in this town believes you're a criminal. Nathan said firmly. "Don't they?" Sarah's laugh came out bitter and hollow. "Mrs. Halloway wouldn't look at you today." "I heard that from Toby, too. It's already working, Nathan. It only took him a few days." "Then we fight it with the truth," Nathan said. "We show them the ledger, the letters. We prove Vane is the criminal, not you, and risk him escalating before we're ready." Sarah shook her head. "No. If we show our hand too early without a lawyer, without a judge who isn't in his pocket, he'll simply destroy the evidence some other way or come for it directly. We need Coburn's connections in Cheyenne to actually mean something first." That something arrived 4 agonizing days later in the form of a telegram from a lawyer named Franklin Reyes, an associate of the man Nathan had originally wired, agreeing to travel to Red Hollow personally to review the documents and advise on how best to proceed. It felt for the first time in over a week like the tide might genuinely be turning. It wasn't. The very night Reyes's telegram arrived, promising his arrival within the week, Nathan woke past midnight to the unmistakable gut-wrenching smell of smoke. He was on his feet and out the door before he'd fully processed what was happening, and what he found in the yard stopped his heart cold. The old hay barn, empty of livestock. Thank God, but full of feed and tools worth more money than Nathan liked to think about, was fully engulfed flames climbing high into the night sky, sparks scattering dangerously close to the main house. "Fire!" Nathan bellowed loud enough to wake the entire property. "Fire everyone up now!" Margaret came running from the house in her nightclothes, screaming for the hired hands. Sarah appeared moments later, face white with horror, staring at the flames with an expression of dawning, terrible understanding. "He did this," she whispered. "This is exactly what he did to that family in Sweetwater County. This is his message." There was no time to process the implication. Nathan and every hired hand on the property spent the next desperate hour fighting the blaze with buckets and wet blankets, managing through sheer, exhausting effort to keep it from spreading to the main house or the working barn where the horses were stabled. By the time the flames finally died to smoking embers, the sky was beginning to lighten toward dawn, and every single person on the ranch stood soot-stained and hollow-eyed, staring at the smoldering ruin of what had been a perfectly good barn 12 hours earlier. "Nobody's hurt," Nathan said, doing a final count of his hands, voice rough with smoke and exhaustion. "That's what matters. Nobody's hurt." But when he turned to find Sarah, she was standing apart from the group, staring at something half buried in the mud near the tree line, something that hadn't been there before the fire started. Nathan crossed to her, and his stomach dropped as he saw what she was looking at. Another note, weighted down with a rock close enough to the burning barn that it had clearly been left deliberately for them to find once the fire was out. This was a warning. Buildings can be rebuilt. People cannot. You have 2 weeks now, not until the end of the month. My patience is not infinite. H.V. Sarah's hands shook as she read it, and this time it was Nathan who felt something inside him break loose. Not fear, but a cold, hard fury that settled deep into his bones. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's enough. Nathan, please don't do anything reckless." "I'm not being reckless," Nathan said. "I'm done being patient. That man just burned my barn and threatened your life on my own land, and I am not waiting 2 more weeks for a lawyer to decide whether he's ready to act." He rode into town the moment the sun was fully up, exhausted, soot still on his hands and face, and marched straight into Sheriff Coburn's office without knocking. "He burned my barn," Nathan said, slamming the second note down on Coburn's desk. "Left this behind so we'd know exactly who to blame and exactly how little time we have left. I need you to act now, Coburn, not when it's politically convenient." Coburn read the note twice, his weathered face growing paler with each pass. "This changes things," he admitted. "Arson on top of everything else, that's not something I can simply patrol around. Give me until tomorrow. I'll wire the territorial marshal myself over Vane's local connections if I have to. A federal officer might not be so easily bought." "Tomorrow might be too late," Nathan said. "It's the fastest I can move within the law," Coburn said. "Unless you're suggesting I do something outside it." Nathan didn't have an answer for that, because some dark, frightened part of him had for one brief and terrible moment actually considered exactly that. He rode home with the weight of that thought sitting heavy and uncomfortable in his chest, and found Sarah waiting for him on the porch, watching for his return, with an expression that told him she already suspected what state he'd be in. What did Coburn say? He's wiring the territorial marshal. Says a federal officer might not be so easy for Vane to buy off. Nathan swung down from his horse exhaustion, hitting him all at once. It's something. It's not enough, but it's something. Sarah searched his face. You look like you're about to do something dangerous. I'm considering several things, Nathan admitted. None of them good ideas. Nathan. She stepped closer, taking his soot-stained hands in hers. Whatever you're thinking, riding to Cheyenne yourself, confronting Vane directly, anything like that, I need you to promise me you won't. I can survive losing my safety. I cannot survive losing you to a bullet because you decided to be reckless on my behalf. Nathan looked down at her, at the fear in her eyes, at the exhaustion and desperation of a woman who had already lost far too much to men like Harold Vane. I promise I won't do anything without talking to you first, he said. That's the best I can offer right now. It would have to be enough because 2 days later, everything changed again in a way neither of them saw coming. Franklin Reyes arrived a full 3 days ahead of schedule, dust-covered from hard travel. A leather satchel of legal papers clutched tight against his chest like it contained gold. He was younger than Nathan expected, sharp-eyed, with the careful, measured manner of a man who chose his words as deliberately as he chose his battles. He spent the better part of a full day poring over Sarah's ledger, the letters, the forged deeds, cross-referencing dates and names with a focused intensity that gave Nathan his first real flicker of hope in over a week. This is remarkable, Reyes finally said, looking up from the documents spread across the kitchen table. Mrs. Prescott, do you understand what you're actually sitting on? This isn't just proof of fraud. This ledger, cross-referenced with these letters, establishes a pattern of criminal conspiracy across at least 4 counties. If even half of this holds up under examination, Harold Vane isn't looking at a fine or a settlement. He's looking at prison for a very long time. Then why hasn't anyone stopped him already? Sarah asked. Otis Graham had some of this same knowledge. It got him killed. Because knowledge without a legal pathway is dangerous, not powerful, Reyes said. Otis Graham likely talked in saloons to the wrong people, without ever formally filing anything with a court that mattered. You've done something smarter, even if you didn't fully realize it. You've kept physical evidence intact in your own possession, untouched by anyone who could be bought or intimidated into losing it. So what happens now? Nathan asked. Now, Reyes said, I take copies of everything back to Cheyenne File, a formal complaint with a federal land office that Vane has no known relationship with, and request an independent investigator. It won't be fast. Men like Vane have a way of delaying these things for months, sometimes years. But it will be real, and it will be outside his control. Relief flooded through Sarah so visibly that her knees actually buckled slightly, and Nathan caught her before she fully swayed, holding her steady against him. Months, she whispered. Can we survive months of him hunting us? That, Reyes said grimly, is the part I can't promise you an answer to. My advice honestly, once this complaint is filed, Vane will know exactly what's coming for him. That's often the most dangerous moment right before a man like that realizes he's cornered and decides he has nothing left to lose. That warning proved prophetic, faster than any of them wanted. Reyes left the following morning documents copied and secured, promising to file the complaint the moment he reached Cheyenne. For 2 days after his departure, the ranch existed in a strange suspended quiet, everyone waiting for some response from Vane that never seemed to come. It was Margaret checking the mail in town on the 3rd day, who came home with the news that shattered whatever fragile peace remained. He's here, she said, breathless, having ridden back to the ranch faster than Nathan had ever seen the older woman move. Harold Vane, in Red Hollow. Checked into the finest room at the hotel this morning, bold as brass, telling anyone who'll listen that he's here on business and looking forward to meeting the town's newest residents personally. Sarah went utterly white. He's coming here, she whispered. Himself, not sending men anymore. He's coming himself. Which means he's either supremely confident, Nathan said grimly, or he's decided this needs to be finished quickly, one way or another, before that complaint reaches a federal investigator. The confrontation came that very evening, and it came in the worst possible way, not privately, not on Nathan's own land where he had every advantage, but in the middle of Red Hollow's main street in front of half the town, as Nathan and Sarah rode in for what should have been a simple supper at the hotel dining room. Harold Vane stood on the hotel porch as they approached, and Nathan understood immediately why the man commanded so much fear and obedience wherever he went. He was tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, in a manner that made every other man on that street look shabby by comparison, with cold, calculating eyes that missed absolutely nothing. "Mrs. Prescott," Vane said pleasantly, stepping down from the porch as their wagon drew near. His voice carrying easily across the street, drawing attention from every direction. "Or should I say Miss Whitmore, or perhaps simply Sarah? You've collected quite a number of names this past year." Sarah's hand found Nathan's arm gripping tight. "Mr. Vane," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice that Nathan could feel she didn't entirely possess. "I wasn't aware you'd traveled all this way." "Business," Vane said smoothly, though his eyes had gone hard and flat. "I understand you've been telling stories about my company to certain lawyers in Cheyenne. Rather creative stories if the rumors are accurate." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the tension crackling in the air, and Nathan felt every instinct in him rise to a defensive edge. "If you have business with Mrs. Prescott," Nathan said, stepping slightly in front of her, "you can conduct it through her lawyer." Vane's gaze shifted to Nathan, assessing dismissive. "And you would be Nathan Cole. She's staying on my land." "Ah." Something ugly flickered across Vane's expression, quickly smoothed away. The rancher who married a woman he'd never met based entirely on letters. How romantic. Though I do wonder, Mr. Cole, whether you fully understood what you were inviting into your home. Theft of company property. Fabrication of documents to slander a respected business. Mrs. Prescott has quite a talent for reinvention, it seems." "That's a lie," Sarah said, voice rising despite herself. "Is it?" Vane turned back to her, and his voice dropped just enough that only those closest could hear, though the threat in it carried regardless. "I have documents of my own, Sarah. Documents that suggest quite convincingly that you altered company ledgers after Edward's death, attempting to extort money from my company by threatening to release fabricated evidence of wrongdoing. I've been remarkably patient about pursuing formal charges out of respect for Edward's memory. That patience has limits." The crowd murmured, and Nathan felt the shift in the air immediately, the same shift Sarah had warned him about, the careful, deliberate work of a man turning public opinion, before he ever needed to lift a hand himself. "You're the one who forged deeds and stole land from families who trusted you," Sarah said louder now, unable to hold back despite the danger of the public setting. "You had Otis Graham killed to keep him quiet. You burned Nathan's barn 3 nights ago to threaten me." Gasps rippled through the small crowd, and Vane's composed expression finally cracked just slightly fury, flashing hard and fast behind his eyes, before he smoothed it back into cold amusement. "Serious accusations," he said quietly, "from a woman with no proof and considerable motive to slander an honest businessman. I'd be careful, Mrs. Prescott, about what you say in public without evidence to back it. Slander carries its own legal consequences. She has proof." Nathan set his voice hard as flint. "A federal investigator's already been requested. It's already in motion, Vane. Whatever you're planning, you're too late to stop it quietly." For one long, terrible moment, Harold Vane's mask slipped entirely, and Nathan saw the real man underneath, cold, ruthless, calculating exactly how much damage he could do before consequences finally caught up with him. "How unfortunate," Vane said softly, "that federal investigations take so very long to actually arrive. So many things can happen in the meantime." He turned and walked back into the hotel without another word, leaving Sarah shaking the crowd, murmuring uncertainly, and Nathan standing rigid with a fury he'd never felt in his entire life. "That was a threat," Sarah whispered. "In front of the whole town, and he still made it a threat." "I heard it," Nathan said grimly. That night, riding back to the ranch in tense silence, Sarah finally spoke the fear that had clearly been building in her since the moment Vane's mask had slipped. "He's not going to wait for that investigation to arrive," she said. "You heard him. He's going to act first." "Then we don't give him the chance," Nathan said. "How?" "He's twice as prepared as we are, Nathan, and he has resources we can't match." Nathan was quiet for a long moment, thinking the wagon wheels creaking rhythmically beneath them. "We stop reacting to what he does," he finally said, "and we make him react to us instead." "What does that mean?" "It means tomorrow we don't wait quietly for Reyes's investigation. We take copies of everything straight to every family whose land Vane stole. We find out how many are still alive, still angry, still willing to speak up now that they know they're not the only ones. A dozen witnesses are a lot harder for a man to buy off or intimidate than one widow alone." Sarah stared at him. "That could take weeks we might not have." "Then we start tonight," Nathan said, "and move faster than he expects." It was admittedly a desperate plan born of exhaustion and fear and a stubborn refusal to keep waiting passively for danger to arrive on its own schedule. But over the following days, it began against all odds to work. Toby, it turned out, knew a family in Sweetwater County, the very family whose barn had burned years earlier for refusing to sign through a cousin who'd married into their circle. A careful letter followed by a careful visit from Nathan and Sarah together revealed a family still furious, still grieving the land they'd lost, entirely willing to testify if it meant finally seeing justice done. 2 more families followed within the week, found through careful word of mouth and Rhea's own contacts in Cheyenne, each one adding their voice, their signature, their own devastating account of Vane's methods to the growing case against him. It felt for the first time since the platform like the tide was genuinely turning in their favor, which was precisely when Harold Vane made his move. Nathan woke before dawn to the sound of Sarah's door. The door he'd specifically fixed to swing easily on its hinges, precisely so she'd never feel trapped being forced open, and a muffled cry cut short, too fast, too abruptly, in a way that sent pure animal terror flooding through his entire body before he was even fully awake. He was in the hallway in seconds, rifle in hand, and what he found stopped his heart entirely. Sarah's room was empty. The window stood open, curtain fluttering in the pre-dawn breeze, and on the floor near the overturned chair lay a single dropped hairpin glinting faintly in the gray morning light. She was gone. Nathan's scream tore through the house before he even realized he'd made a sound. "Sarah!" Margaret came stumbling out of her room, half-dressed face white with terror, and one look at Nathan's expression told her everything she needed to know. "Oh God," she breathed. "Oh God, no." "Get every hand on this property up and armed," Nathan said, his voice shaking with a fury so cold it barely sounded like him. "Now, Margaret, I need horses saddled and I need it done in 5 minutes." He was back in Sarah's room before Margaret had even finished nodding. Dropping to his knees beside the overturned chair, examining the open window with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The frame showed scuff marks along the sill. Someone had come through, it not gone out through it, which meant whoever took her had planned this, had known exactly which window led to her room. That meant they'd been watching the house. Closely. For days, maybe longer. Nathan's stomach twisted violently at the thought of some stranger studying his home, learning its patterns, waiting for the precise moment everyone would be asleep and least prepared. He found the second hairpin near the window, and beside it, in the soft dirt just outside a boot print, the same large print he'd found on the eastern fence line nearly 2 weeks earlier. "He's had someone here the whole time," Nathan muttered. "Watching, waiting for exactly this chance." Toby came sprinting from the bunkhouse, still pulling on his shirt. 3 other hired hands close behind him, all of them wide-eyed and grim in the pale pre-dawn light. "Mr. Cole, what happened?" "Sarah's gone," Nathan said, forcing the words out through a throat gone tight with terror. "Taken through her window sometime in the last hour. I need tracks followed now before the light gets any better, and whoever did this realizes we're already moving." The tracks led east away from the house toward a stretch of rocky ground where a wagon could travel without leaving obvious wheel ruts, a route Nathan realized with sick certainty that had clearly been planned in advance by someone who knew his property well enough to choose the hardest possible ground to track across. "Split up," Nathan ordered, mounting his horse, with hands that finally mercifully steadied now that he had something to do besides stand helpless in an empty room. "Toby, ride for Sheriff Coburn. Tell him what's happened. Tell him to meet us on the Cheyenne Road. The rest of you with me." They rode hard through the graying dawn, following what tracks they could find across the rocky ground. Nathan's mind spinning through every terrible possibility with each mile that passed. Vane wouldn't kill her immediately. That math was simple enough. A dead woman couldn't be forced to hand over documents, couldn't be pressured into silence through fear rather than finality. He needed her alive at least until he had what he wanted. That thought was the only thing keeping Nathan from losing his mind completely, as the sun climbed higher and the tracks grew harder to follow across increasingly rocky terrain. They found the wagon nearly 2 hours later, abandoned at a crossroads, where the rocky ground gave way back to softer dirt, and beside it, unmistakably fresh horse tracks leading off toward an old mining road that hadn't been actively used in years. "They switched to horseback here," said Curtis, Nathan's foreman, crouching beside the tracks with the careful eye of a man who'd tracked cattle and men both across this territory for 2 decades. "2 horses, maybe 3, moving fast but not panicked. This was planned clean." "How far ahead?" Curtis studied the tracks a moment longer. "Hour, maybe less. We're gaining." Hope flared hot and dangerous in Nathan's chest, and he kicked his horse forward before Curtis had even finished speaking, the rest of the men scrambling to keep pace. They found Sheriff Coburn waiting at the base of the old mining road, exactly where Toby had directed him, a deputy, and 2 more armed men at his side, faces grim with purpose. "Old Prescott mine," Coburn said without preamble the moment Nathan reined in beside him. "Abandoned about 6 years back when the vein ran dry. If someone wanted a place to hold a person quietly away from town, away from prying eyes, that mine's about the best option within 20 miles. You think that's where they're taking her?" "I think," Coburn said grimly, "that Harold Vane's been in this territory long enough to know that mine exists, and long enough to have scouted it as exactly the kind of place a desperate man does desperate business." They rode the final stretch together, a small, tense army moving fast and quiet along the old mining road. Every man's rifle checked and ready, every nerve in Nathan's body stretched taut with a fear he'd never known could physically hurt this much. The mine entrance came into view as the sun finally cleared the eastern hills. A dark scar cut into the hillside timber supports weathered gray with age, and outside it, unmistakably, 2 horses tied to a rusted equipment cart. "That's them," Nathan breathed. "Easy," Coburn warned, raising a hand to signal the others to slow. "We rush in there blind, we might get her killed before we get a shot at saving her. Let me think this through." But Nathan was already off, his horse rifle in hand, moving toward the mine entrance with a singular, desperate focus that no amount of caution could have slowed. "Cole," Coburn hissed. "Wait for the rest of us, damn it!" Nathan didn't wait. He reached the mine entrance just as raised voices echoed from somewhere deep within the dark tunnel. Sarah's voice, sharp with fear, but unmistakably alive. And beneath it, a man's voice, cold and controlled in a way Nathan recognized immediately. "Harold Vane." "Last chance to be reasonable, Sarah," Vane was saying, his voice carrying eerily through the tunnel's rock walls. "Tell me where the original documents are hidden, and this ends peacefully. Continue this foolish resistance, and I promise you it ends very differently." "I already told the lawyer everything." Sarah's voice came back shaking but defiant. "Copies are already in Cheyenne. Destroying me doesn't destroy the evidence anymore, Harold. You're already finished." A sound followed a sharp crack of something striking something else, and Sarah's cry of pain that ripped straight through Nathan's chest like a physical blow. He was moving before conscious thought caught up, rifle raised, storming into the darkness of the mine tunnel with a roar that echoed off the rock walls. Vane. The scene that greeted him in the flickering lantern light stopped his heart cold. Sarah stood pressed against the rock wall, hands bound in front of her, a fresh red mark blooming across her cheek where she'd clearly been struck. Beside her, a large man Nathan recognized instantly as Del Ashford stood with a pistol trained loosely on her, while Harold Vane himself stood a few feet away, dressed impeccably. Even here in an abandoned mine, like violence was simply beneath his wardrobe rather than his character. Mr. Cole, Vane said, turning with only mild surprise, as though Nathan's arrival was merely an inconvenient interruption rather than a genuine threat. How resourceful of you to find us so quickly. Though I suppose a determined man tends to be when the woman he loves is involved. Let her go, Nathan said, rifle leveled steady at Vane's chest, despite the trembling fury coursing through his entire body. Now, I don't think you're in a position to make demands, Vane said calmly. Ashford here has a gun pointed directly at Mrs. Prescott. You put a bullet in me, and his finger finds that trigger before I even hit the ground. Simple mathematics, Mr. Cole. I'd think carefully before doing anything foolish. Nathan's finger hovered over the trigger, every instinct screaming at him to act, while cold logic held him frozen, aware that Vane was entirely correct about the mathematics of the situation. Nathan, don't, Sarah said, voice shaking but clear. Please. It's not worth it. Everything about you is worth it, Nathan said, not taking his eyes off Vane. Vane's mouth curled into something almost like admiration. How touching. Truly. If circumstances were different, I might even find this romantic. His expression hardened instantly. But circumstances are what they are, Mr. Cole, so let's discuss them plainly. I want the original documents. Not copies, the actual ledger, the actual letters, the actual deeds Mrs. Prescott has been carrying around for a year, like some kind of insurance policy. Bring them to me, and everyone in this mine walks out alive today. And if I don't have them on me right now, Nathan said, if they're locked somewhere safe exactly because I anticipated a moment like this one. Something flickered across Vane's composed face, the first genuine crack of uncertainty Nathan had seen from him. Then you'd better arrange to retrieve them quickly, Vane said, though his voice had lost some of its smooth confidence. Because my patience, as I've said before, has limits, and Mrs. Prescott's continued comfort depends entirely on how quickly you demonstrate good faith. Behind Vane at the mine entrance, Nathan caught the faintest flicker of movement. Sheriff Coburn and his men finally arriving, spreading carefully into positions along the tunnel's edges, weapons ready, waiting for the right moment. Nathan needed to keep Vane talking, needed to buy time. You've made a lot of mistakes in the last 2 weeks, Nathan said, forcing steadiness into his voice. Signing that note, coming to Red Hollow yourself instead of staying hidden in Cheyenne, kidnapping a woman in front of witnesses who already know her story. Careful mistakes are still mistakes, Vane acknowledged coolly, but desperate men make them regardless. And I confess, growing rather desperate, Mr. Cole. That federal investigation your lawyer friend filed is a genuine problem, one I intend to solve before it becomes an insurmountable one. By killing us, by eliminating the evidence and the witness, Vane corrected, as though the distinction mattered morally in any meaningful way. Whether that requires killing anyone depends entirely on how reasonable everyone chooses to be in the next few minutes. Nathan, Sarah said suddenly, her voice carrying a strange new steadiness. He's stalling too. Look at him. He's as scared of that investigation as we are of him. Vane's eyes flicked to her sharply. Careful, Sarah. Why? She pressed some fire returning to her voice despite her bound hands and bruised cheek. What more can you actually do to me that you haven't already threatened burn another barn? Kidnap me a second time. Every single thing you do just adds another crime to a list that's already going to bury you, Harold. Sarah, stop, Nathan said quietly, watching Vane's composure fray further with every word she spoke, aware that provoking a cornered, desperate man holding all the immediate leverage was a dangerous game. But Sarah wasn't finished. You know what the worst part is, she said, looking directly at Vane now. Edward believed in you, trusted you completely. Right up until the day he died coughing up blood from mine work you never even paid him properly for. And you're standing here still trying to protect a fortune built on stolen land and broken families, instead of just admitting what you actually are. Enough, Vane snapped, and something in his controlled facade finally shattered entirely, his hand snapping out to grip Sarah's bound wrists hard enough to make her cry out. That was the moment Sheriff Coburn chose to act. "Vane, drop the woman, and put your hands where I can see them." Chaos erupted in the confined space of the mine tunnel. Ashford's gun swung wildly toward the new threat. Vane shoved Sarah hard against the rock wall as he spun to assess the sudden appearance of armed lawmen, and Nathan, seizing the split second of confusion, launched himself directly at Vane before conscious thought could slow him down. The two men crashed to the ground together, Nathan's rifle clattering away uselessly across the stone floor, both of them grappling desperately in the flickering lantern light. Somewhere behind them, a gunshot rang out deafening in the enclosed tunnel, followed immediately by a second, and Sarah's scream cut through everything else. Nathan's world narrowed to nothing but the immediate fight. Vane's fist connecting hard with his jaw, the taste of blood. His own hands finding purchase on Vane's collar and slamming the man's head against the rock wall with a fury born of 2 weeks of accumulated terror. "Nathan!" Sarah's voice closed now, desperate. "Nathan, stop! He's not moving!" Nathan blinked through the haze of adrenaline and fury, realizing Vane had indeed gone still beneath him, unconscious or worse from the impact against the rock wall. He looked up, chest heaving, and found Sheriff Coburn standing over Ashford's slumped form, smoking pistol still raised, while one of his deputies pressed a cloth against his own bleeding shoulder. "He's alive," Coburn said grimly, looking down at Ashford. "Winged him before he could get a clean shot off." "I'm fine," Nathan said, though his knuckles were split and bleeding, and his jaw throbbed with a pain he'd process properly later. He turned immediately to Sarah, still pressed against the rock wall, hands still bound, tears streaming freely down her face. "Sarah." He crossed to her in 2 steps, working desperately at the ropes binding her wrists with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Sarah, look at me. Are you hurt? Tell me you're not hurt." "I'm okay," she gasped, the rope finally giving way, and then her arms were around him, gripping tight enough to bruise both of them, shaking with the aftermath of terror finally released. "I'm okay, Nathan. You found me. You actually found me." "I told you I wouldn't let you disappear again," Nathan said into her hair, voice cracking. "I meant it." Behind them, Coburn was securing Vane's unconscious form with rope of his own, calling instructions to his men, the practical business of arrest and evidence beginning even as Nathan and Sarah remained locked together in the dim mine tunnel, unwilling to let go. "Is it over?" Sarah finally whispered. "Is it actually over?" Coburn, overhearing, shook his head grimly as he finished binding Vane's wrists. "Wish I could say yes, Mrs. Prescott. But we've got him on kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder, now dead to rights with plenty of witnesses. That's enough to hold him regardless of what happens with the fraud investigation. It's a start. A damn good one." "A start," Sarah repeated, and something like genuine hope flickered across her exhausted face for the first time in longer than Nathan could remember. After a year of running, that actually sounds like enough for today. They emerged from the mine into full daylight, and Nathan had never in his life been so grateful to feel the sun on his face. Sarah leaned heavily against him as they walked, adrenaline finally draining away and leaving pure exhaustion in its wake, and Nathan kept one arm wrapped tight around her the entire way back to the horses, unwilling to create even a small distance between them after everything they'd just survived. The ride back to Red Hollow felt different from any ride Nathan had taken in his entire life. Vane and Ashford bound and guarded by Coburn's deputies, Sarah safe beside him, the terrible weight of the last 2 weeks finally beginning, however slowly, to lift. News of Vane's arrest spread through Red Hollow like wildfire before they'd even fully reached the sheriff's office. By the time they arrived, a small crowd had already gathered outside, drawn by whispers of kidnapping and gunfire, and the atmosphere in the street had shifted entirely from the suspicious tension of weeks earlier into something closer to shocked vindication. Mrs. Halloway from the dress shop was among the first to approach her earlier coldness entirely. Forgotten hands pressed to her mouth in horror as she took in Sarah's bruised cheek and disheveled state. "My dear," she said, "we had no idea the things that man was saying about you." "It's all right," Sarah said, though her voice remained tired and thin. "You didn't know the truth. Now you do." Whitfield from the Mercantile pushed through the small crowd, next offering a stammered apology for the whispers he'd helped spread weeks earlier. And one by one, the town that had briefly turned suspicious began instead turning genuinely fiercely supportive, horrified to learn how close to real tragedy their small community had actually come. Inside the sheriff's office, Coburn set about the grim business of processing his prisoners, while a doctor was summoned to look at Sarah's cheek and Nathan's split knuckles, both. "You'll bruise," the doctor said to Sarah, gently examining the mark on her face. "But nothing's broken. You were fortunate." "I don't feel particularly fortunate," Sarah admitted, wincing slightly at his touch. "You're alive," Nathan said quietly, sitting beside her, his own bruised hand wrapped now in fresh bandages. "After everything that happened in that mine, I'll take fortunate in whatever form it comes." That evening, as the sun began sinking low over Red Hollow, Sheriff Coburn found them still sitting together in his office, waiting for word on what would happen next. "Wired the territorial marshal's office the moment we got back," he told them. "Told them exactly what happened, the kidnapping, the assault, the shooting. Given the severity, they're sending someone out within the week to formally take custody of Vane and Ashford, both transport them to a federal facility for holding until trial." "And the fraud charges?" Sarah asked. "The stolen land, the burned barn in Sweetwater County, Otis Graham's death. With kidnapping and attempted murder already proven in front of witnesses, with a lawman's own testimony behind it, I suspect those additional charges are going to land a lot easier than they might have otherwise," Coburn said. "Men don't usually get much sympathy from judges once they've already been caught red-handed doing something this violent. Your lawyer friend's investigation just got considerably easier to prosecute." Relief washed visibly over Sarah's exhausted face, and for the first time in longer than Nathan could remember, she allowed herself something close to a genuine, unguarded smile. "After a year," she said softly, "I almost don't know what to do with that feeling." "Get some rest," Coburn suggested gently. "That's what you do with it. The legal business will sort itself out in time. Tonight you've earned nothing more complicated than sleep." Nathan drove Sarah home himself, the wagon moving slow and easy through the gathering dusk, both of them too exhausted for much conversation, content simply to sit close together, her head resting against his shoulder, the terrible weight of the last several weeks finally gradually beginning to lift from both their shoulders. Margaret met them at the door, having heard the news secondhand from a rider Toby had sent ahead, and immediately pulled Sarah into a fierce, tearful embrace. "I was worried sick," Margaret said, holding Sarah at arm's length to examine the bruise on her cheek with a mother's critical eye. "Worried absolutely sick. Don't you dare frighten me like that again, you hear me?" "I'll do my best," Sarah said, laughing weakly through her exhaustion. That night, after a quiet supper eaten mostly in relieved silence, Nathan walked Sarah down the hallway to her room, the same easy swinging door, the same window he'd promised would always offer her an escape route if she needed one. "I keep thinking about something," Sarah said, pausing in the doorway. "In that mine when Vane had Ashford's gun pointed at me, and you burst in anyway, rifle raised without any real plan beyond simply refusing to leave me there, I thought for certain I was about to watch you die trying to save me." "I wasn't going to let anything happen to you," Nathan said simply. "I know," Sarah said. "That's exactly what terrified me. Because in that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself accept until then." "What's that?" "That I love you." Sarah said the words coming out soft, but absolutely certain. Not the memory of the boy from the creek. You, Nathan Cole, exactly as you are now, stubborn, fierce, willing to charge into a mine with a rifle against impossible odds because you refuse to imagine a world without me in it. I love you. Nathan's breath caught entirely, and for a moment he simply stared at her 20 years of longing and 2 weeks of terror, and this single perfect moment all colliding together at once. "Sarah," he said, voice rough with emotion. "I have loved you since I was 12 years old, standing at an empty creek, refusing to believe you were really gone. I loved the letters from a stranger named Clara, before I ever knew they were yours. And I have loved you every single day since you stepped off that train and turned my entire world upside down. I love you completely, exactly as you are, now bruises and fear and fierce stubbornness included." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Good tears this time, the first Nathan had seen from her that carried no trace of fear at all. 20 years, she whispered, and we finally said it. 20 years. Nathan agreed, reaching up to gently touch the uninjured side of her face. But I think honestly, some part of me has been saying it every single day since you left. I just never had anywhere to send the words. Sarah stepped forward and kissed him. Then soft and slow and utterly certain, no fear left in it at all. Only 20 years of longing, finally completely answered. When they finally broke apart, both of them slightly breathless, Sarah rested her forehead against his chest, listening to his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her ear. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "After the marshal takes Vane away after the trial, after all of this legal business finally settles." Nathan considered the question seriously, wanting to give her an honest answer rather than an easy one. "Now," he said, "we build something. A real life together on this ranch with Margaret driving us both crazy, and Toby learning to be a proper hand instead of a nervous boy, and neighbors who finally understand exactly what kind of woman you actually are. We stop running Sarah, both of us. We just build." Sarah smiled against his chest, and for the first time in over a year, the smile carried no trace of fear at all. "I would like that," she whispered. "I would like that more than anything." The following week passed in a strange welcome quiet. After so much chaos, the territorial marshal arriving exactly as promised to take formal custody of Vane and Ashford, both their transport to a federal holding facility conducted under heavy guard. The town of Red Hollow slowly settling back into its normal rhythms, while whispers of the dramatic arrest continued circulating for weeks afterward. Franklin Reyes returned briefly to formally document Sarah's testimony regarding the kidnapping, adding it to the growing case against Vane, his expression grave but satisfied, as he reviewed the sheer weight of evidence now stacked against the man. Between the fraud documentation, the witness families, and now kidnapping and attempted murder charges with a sheriff's own testimony behind them. Reyes told them, sitting once again at the same kitchen table where he'd first reviewed Sarah's ledger weeks earlier. "I'd be shocked if Harold Vane sees freedom again in his lifetime. This is about as thorough a case as I've encountered in 15 years of practice." "And the families he stole from?" Sarah asked. "Will they see their land returned? Any compensation at all?" "That's part of what the trial will determine," Reyes said. "But given the weight of evidence, I'd say their chances are considerably better than they were a month ago. You did that, Mrs. Prescott. Your courage in keeping those documents in, refusing to simply disappear and let Vane continue unchecked, that's what made this possible." Sarah absorbed that with visible emotion, glancing at Nathan beside her, understanding fully for the first time the true weight of what she'd accomplished simply by choosing again and again not to run. That evening, after Reyes departed once more for Cheyenne, Nathan found Sarah sitting alone by the creek at the edge of his property, the same creek he realized with a jolt where they'd played as children 20 years earlier, though neither of them had consciously chosen to return there since her arrival. "I used to come here every day," Nathan said, settling down beside her on the grassy bank. "After your family left, for almost a month straight. I kept thinking if I just waited long enough you'd come walking back down that path like nothing had ever happened." "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly, "for everything that happened to you waiting for someone who never came." "Don't be sorry," Nathan said, "because in a strange way, you did come back. It just took 20 years and considerably more danger than either of us would have chosen." Sarah laughed softly, leaning her head against his shoulder as the creek burbled gently past them in the fading evening light. "Do you believe things happen for a reason?" she asked. "Or is that just something people say to make tragedy feel more bearable?" Nathan considered the question seriously, watching the water move steadily over smooth stones worn down by 20 years of patient, persistent current. "I believe," he finally said, "that some people are worth waiting for however long it takes, and however much pain the waiting costs along the way. I don't know if that's fate or luck, or simply stubbornness on both our parts. But I know that whatever brought you back to me, I'm not questioning it anymore. I'm just grateful." Sarah turned to look at him, and something in her expression had shifted entirely from the frightened, cautious woman who'd stepped off that train weeks earlier, replaced now by someone steadier. Someone who had finally fully allowed herself to believe that safety and love might genuinely be possible again. "Nathan," she said quietly, "when all of this legal business finally settles the trial, the sentencing, everything, I don't want to just be your mail-order bride anymore. I don't want an arrangement built out of necessity and danger and letters between strangers. What do you want instead?" Sarah took a breath, and Nathan watched her gather courage for whatever she was about to say next. "I want a real marriage," she said. "One built on everything we've actually learned about each other these past few weeks. The fear, the courage, the way you charged into a mine without any plan except refusing to lose me. I want to marry you properly. Nathan Cole. Not because an advertisement brought us together, and not because danger forced us to depend on each other. I want to marry you because I love you completely, and because for the first time in longer than I can remember, I actually believe in the life we might build together." Nathan's throat tightened with emotion so strong he could barely speak. "Sarah Miller," he finally managed. "Will you marry me? Properly this time. No advertisement, no false names, no danger forcing our hand. Just you and me choosing each other exactly as we are." Sarah's answer came without a single second of hesitation. "Yes," she said, tears spilling freely down her cheeks, even as she smiled wider than Nathan had seen from her since her arrival. "Yes, Nathan, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her there by the creek in the fading golden light of a Wyoming evening, 20 years and countless dangers finally completely resolved into a single perfect moment of certainty. Behind them, unnoticed by either Margaret, stood watching from a discreet distance near the tree line, having wandered out to call them in for supper, and finding instead a sight far too precious to interrupt. She wiped quietly at her own eyes, smiling to herself, before turning back toward the house to let the two of them have this moment entirely to themselves. Some things she thought walking back through the gathering dusk were simply worth the wait. The following morning, the engagement was still settling into something real when Toby came riding up the drive with a letter that made Nathan's stomach drop before he'd even broken the seal. "From Cheyenne," Toby said, "marked urgent. The rider said Mr. Reyes wanted it in your hands, personal, nobody else's." Sarah appeared on the porch, wiping flour from her hands, watching Nathan's face change as he read. "What is it?" "Trial date set," Nathan said slowly. 3 weeks from now. Reyes says Vane's hired the best defense money can buy out of Denver, and word is, they're going to argue the whole case is a conspiracy cooked up by a grieving widow and a jealous rancher trying to seize sympathy and land. Sarah's face went carefully blank the way it always did when fear tried to take hold, and she refused to let it show. "He's still fighting," she said, "even from a jail cell." "Men like that don't stop fighting until somebody makes them," Nathan said. "Reyes wants us in Cheyenne a full week early. Wants to prepare you for cross-examination. Says Vane's lawyers will try to tear apart every decision you made this past year, make you look unstable, unreliable, anything to plant doubt." "Let them try," Sarah said, though her voice trembled slightly. "I've survived worse than lawyers." Margaret, listening from the doorway, crossed her arms. "You're not doing this alone, either of you. I'm coming to Cheyenne." "Margaret, someone needs to run the ranch. Curtis can run the ranch for 2 weeks without the whole place falling into the creek," Margaret said firmly. "I buried my own husband young, and I sat through his killer's trial alone because nobody thought an old woman needed company. I am not letting that happen to either of you." Sarah's eyes filled, and she crossed the porch to embrace the older woman tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Margaret said, patting her back briskly to hide her own emotion. "Wait till you've heard me complain the entire stagecoach ride there." They left for Cheyenne 4 days later, the ranch entrusted to Curtis, and the hands the wedding now formally planned for the month following the trial, pushed carefully to the back of everyone's mind. Though Nathan caught Sarah more than once staring out the stagecoach window with a small private smile that told him she hadn't forgotten it entirely. Cheyenne was louder, busier, more crowded than Red Hollow had ever prepared any of them for. Brick buildings crowding the streets, telegraph wires crossing overhead, the noise of a proper city pressing in from every direction. Franklin Reyes met them at the stage depot himself, looking sharper and more serious than Nathan remembered from his visits to the ranch. "Good, you're early," Reyes said, shaking Nathan's hand before turning to Sarah with a grave expression. "Mrs. Prescott, I won't lie to you. This is going to be difficult. Vane's lawyers are good, and they are going to come at you hard. I need you ready for that before you ever step into that courtroom." "I'm ready," Sarah said. "You say that now," Reyes said, not unkindly. "Let's make sure it's still true after 3 days of practice cross-examination." Those 3 days proved harder than anything Sarah had endured since the mine. Reyes played the role of Vane's defense attorney with unsettling precision, hammering at every soft place in her story. Why had she kept the documents, instead of turning them over to authorities immediately? Why had she used a false name to secure a marriage under false pretenses? Wasn't it true that grief and financial desperation might make a woman say almost anything to secure a wealthy protector? By the second evening, Sarah sat at the small boarding house table, hands trembling, tears finally breaking through the careful composure she'd maintained for days. "I can't do this," she whispered. "Every question makes me sound like a liar, Nathan, even when I'm telling the complete truth." Nathan knelt in front of her chair, taking her shaking hands in his. "That's exactly what they want you to feel. Reyes is showing you their worst now, so the real thing feels easier by comparison. You are not a liar, Sarah. You are the only person brave enough to keep proof of a crime when burning it would have been so much safer." "What if the jury doesn't see it that way?" "Then we make them see it," Nathan said. "One honest answer at a time." Reyes, overhearing from the doorway, nodded slowly. "He's right. And for what it's worth, Mrs. Prescott, you're already handling this better than most witnesses I've prepared in 15 years. The fact that it's hard doesn't mean you're failing. It means you understand exactly how much is riding on it." The trial began on a cold, bright morning. The small Cheyenne courthouse, packed nearly to bursting with spectators, drawn by weeks of increasingly dramatic rumor. Nathan sat in the front row beside Margaret, watching Harold Vane enter in a fine suit, clean-shaven, composed, playing the role of wronged businessman, with the same practiced ease he'd once used to charm an entire town. The first 2 days belonged to the prosecution. The ledger entered into evidence, the forged deeds examined by a handwriting expert who testified with cold certainty that Vane's own signature appeared on documents he'd sworn he'd never seen, family after family from Sweetwater County and beyond, taking the stand to describe land taken through threats, fires, and lies. Nathan watched the jury's faces harden with every testimony. Watched sympathy for the wronged families build steadily in a room that had started the trial deeply uncertain. Then on the third day, Sarah took the stand. Vane's lead attorney, a sharp-featured man named Griggs, rose slowly, and Nathan felt Margaret's hand grip his arm tight as the cross-examination began. "Mrs. Prescott," Griggs said smoothly, "you married Nathan Cole under a false name, did you not?" "I did," Sarah said, voice steady, despite the flush rising in her cheeks. "Isn't it true that you were in fact running from creditors of your late husband's estate? That the story of stolen documents and a criminal conspiracy is simply a convenient fiction to explain your flight and secure sympathy, along with a wealthy new husband?" the courtroom murmured. Nathan's jaw clenched hard enough to ache. "No," Sarah said, meeting Griggs' eyes without flinching. "It's true I was running, but I was running from a man who had already caused the deaths of at least 2 people connected to his crimes, and who threatened my life the moment he learned I possessed proof of what he'd done. Proof you conveniently kept rather than turning over to authorities the moment you found it. I was a grieving widow, with no standing, no money, and no way to prove my husband's employer was behind a criminal scheme spanning multiple counties." Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with every word. "I had watched what happened to a man who talked too loudly about what he knew. I made the only choice that felt survivable at the time: keep the proof close, and find somewhere safe enough to eventually bring it forward. And you found that safety," Griggs pressed, "by deceiving an honest rancher into marriage under a false identity." "I never deceived Nathan about who I was as a person," Sarah said, and for the first time real fire entered her voice. I answered his advertisement honestly in every way that mattered, my hopes, my values, what I wanted from a partnership. The only thing I withheld was a name, because the truth of that name came with a death sentence attached to it. I would make that same choice again in a heartbeat to survive long enough to see justice done. Griggs pressed harder, circling the same accusations from different angles for nearly an hour. But Sarah's composure held, growing steadier, rather than more fragile with every attempt to break it, until finally the judge called for a recess, and Nathan watched Sarah nearly collapse with relief the moment she stepped down from the stand. "You were extraordinary," he whispered, pulling her into his arms the moment she reached him. "I was terrified," Sarah admitted, shaking against him. "Terrified and extraordinary aren't opposites," Nathan said. "They're usually the same thing." The final blow to Vane's defense came on the fourth day, when Sheriff Coburn took the stand to describe the kidnapping and the confrontation in the mine. His testimony, methodical, unshakable, corroborated by two deputies who'd witnessed the same events. Griggs attempted to suggest Coburn had rushed to judgment, acted with insufficient evidence, but the sheriff's calm, detailed account of Ashford's raised weapon and Vane's own threats, delivered with the flat authority of a man who had genuinely feared for lives that day, left little room for doubt in anyone's mind. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Nathan sat gripping Sarah's hand so tightly his knuckles had gone white, both of them barely breathing, as the foreman rose to deliver the verdict. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud," the foreman announced, "we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of kidnapping, guilty. On the charge of attempted murder, guilty." The courtroom erupted, and Sarah's composure finally broke entirely. Sobs of pure relief shaking her whole body as Nathan wrapped his arms around her, both of them barely hearing the judge's subsequent pronouncement of a sentence that would keep Harold Vane behind bars for the remainder of his natural life. Across the courtroom, Vane's face had gone gray and slack, the confident mask finally completely stripped away, and as the bailiffs led him from the room, his eyes found Sarah's one last time. "This isn't finished," he said low and venomous before a bailiff shoved him forward. "Yes," Sarah said clearly, loud enough for the entire departing courtroom to hear her voice steady despite everything. "It is." And it was. The weeks following the trial passed in a blur of practical relief, Reyes confirming that the families whose land had been stolen would see restitution proceedings begin immediately. The Territorial Land Office moving with unusual speed once Vane's conviction removed any remaining political protection he'd once enjoyed. Sheriff Coburn receiving a formal commendation for his role in bringing down a conspiracy that had touched 4 counties. Sarah received her own letters of gratitude arriving steadily over the following month from families she'd never met, people whose land had been returned or whose compensation had finally been secured because a widow in Wyoming had refused to burn a stack of dangerous papers when burning them would have been so much easier. "I keep thinking about something Reyes said," Sarah told Nathan one evening sitting on the porch of the ranch they'd finally returned to, letters spread across her lap. "That knowledge without a legal pathway is dangerous, not powerful. I spent a year believing I was simply carrying a burden. I never quite let myself believe I was carrying justice." "You were carrying both," Nathan said. "That's what made it so heavy." "It doesn't feel heavy anymore," Sarah admitted, looking out over the pasture where cattle grazed peacefully in the golden evening light. "For the first time in 3 years, it just feels like I'm finally standing still instead of running." Margaret, coming out to join them with a tray of coffee, snorted good-naturedly. "Well, you'd better get used to standing still because we've got a wedding to plan, and I refuse to let either of you turn this into another dramatic ordeal. This one's going to be simple, joyful, and entirely free of kidnappers." Sarah laughed real unburdened laughter, and Nathan felt his chest fill with something that had been missing for 20 long years. The wedding took place 6 weeks later on a clear autumn afternoon, with the aspens along the creek turning gold, and the entire town of Red Hollow turning out to witness it. A town that had once whispered suspicion about a mysterious mail-order bride, now gathering warmly to celebrate the woman who had in the end brought down one of the most dangerous men in 3 territories. Sarah wore a simple dress, nothing elaborate, standing beside the same creek where they'd played as children, and where Nathan had proposed weeks earlier. And as Nathan watched her walk toward him across the grass, Margaret weeping openly in the front row of gathered townsfolk, he felt every year of loneliness he'd carried since childhood finally completely dissolve. "You look terrified," Sarah whispered as she reached him, a teasing smile on her lips, despite her own nervous energy. "I've faced down an armed kidnapper," Nathan whispered back. "This is somehow worse." "Good," Sarah said, "because I intend for this to matter a great deal more than that day did." The preacher's words passed in a blur that Nathan would never fully recall in detail afterward. Only the steady warmth of Sarah's hands in his, the sound of her voice as she spoke her vows clear and unshaking, the roar of applause from the gathered town as the preacher finally pronounced them husband and wife. Nathan kissed his bride beside the creek where they'd once been children together, and the whole of Red Hollow erupted into cheering that echoed off the surrounding hills. 20 years of separation and weeks of danger finally completely resolved into pure, uncomplicated joy. That evening, after the celebration had wound down, and the last of the well-wishing neighbors had finally departed, Nathan and Sarah walked back down to the creek alone, the same water still moving steadily over the same smooth stones, patient and unchanged, despite everything that had happened around it. 20 years ago, Sarah said softly, leaning against her husband's side, I stood in this exact spot and told you I'd leave this town someday, and that you'd come with me. I had no idea how wrong I'd get the second half of that promise. You got the first half right, Nathan said. You did leave. It just took 2 decades and a very dangerous detour to bring you back to exactly where you started. Do you regret any of it? Sarah asked. The waiting. The fear these past weeks brought into your life. If I'd never answered that advertisement, you'd have a simpler life right now. Nathan turned to face her, fully taking both her hands in his. A simpler life isn't the same as a better one, he said. I spent 20 years telling myself solitude was easier than disappointment, that expecting nothing meant I could never be let down. That wasn't peace, Sarah. That was just a slower kind of loss, stretched out over 2 decades, instead of happening all at once. You didn't bring danger into a peaceful life. You brought life into a life that had already quietly given up on itself. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, though these carried none of the fear that had haunted so many tears these past weeks. I love you, she said. Not the memory, not the ghost of a girl from a creek, or the ghost of a boy who waited there for her. You, Nathan Cole, exactly as you are, and exactly as I am. I love you too, Nathan said. Completely and without a single doubt left in me. They stood together by the creek as the sun sank fully behind the western hills, the sky bleeding into deep gold and violet. The same colors that had painted this same sky 20 years earlier. When 2 children had made a promise, neither of them fully understood the weight of at the time. Behind them, back at the ranch house, warm light spilled from every window. Margaret already bustling about preparing a late supper despite her protests that today of all days, someone else should be doing the cooking. Toby, in the other hands, had strung lanterns along the porch rail for the occasion. And somewhere inside, a fiddle had struck up a slow, familiar tune that drifted out across the yard. Sarah looked toward the house at the warm light and the music and the life waiting for her there, and something settled in her chest that she recognized finally and completely as peace. Home, she said quietly, testing the word the way she had that first day on the wagon ride from the depot. Home. Nathan agreed, and this time there was no hesitation in either of their voices at all. In the months that followed, the Coal Valley Ranch became something neither of them had ever quite believed possible in the darkest weeks of the previous year. Not merely a working ranch, but a genuine home filled with laughter, with Margaret's endless good-natured scolding with Toby growing steadily more confident under Nathan's patient guidance with neighbors who now considered Sarah as much a fixture of Red Hollow as anyone born there. Word arrived eventually that Harold Vane's appeals had all failed, that he would spend the remainder of his life in a federal prison, far from Wyoming, his fortune seized and distributed in restitution to the families he'd wronged across 4 counties. Sarah read the letter confirming it standing in the same kitchen where she'd first told Nathan and Margaret the whole truth of her past. And when she finished reading, she simply folded the letter carefully and set it aside. No tears, no trembling hands, only a quiet, settled kind of closure. "Is it strange," she asked Nathan that evening, "that I don't feel triumphant? After everything he did, I thought I'd feel something bigger than this." "Maybe justice isn't supposed to feel triumphant," Nathan said thoughtfully. "Maybe it's just supposed to feel like the weight finally lifting so you can go back to living the rest of your life without checking over your shoulder." Sarah considered that for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly what it feels like." That winter snow settled deep and quiet over the Wyoming hills, and the ranch house, that had once felt so empty and unfinished to Nathan, now hummed with warmth through every long, cold evening. Sarah teaching herself new recipes from Margaret's careful instruction, Nathan building a proper garden bed for the spring. Exactly as Sarah had described wanting in her very first letter, the two of them falling into a rhythm of shared life that felt after everything remarkably wonderfully ordinary. One evening in early spring, nearly a year to the day since Sarah had first stepped off that train, Nathan found her standing at the kitchen window, watching the last of the snow melt away from the pasture, a soft, private smile on her face that told him she was thinking about something significant. "What is it?" he asked, coming up beside her. Sarah turned to him, taking his hand and pressing it gently against her still flat stomach, her eyes bright with an emotion Nathan had never quite seen from her before. "I have something to tell you," she said softly, "that has absolutely nothing to do with Harold Vane or forged deeds or anything from that whole terrible year. Something entirely new." Nathan's breath caught as understanding dawned across his face. 20 years of loneliness and weeks of danger and months of healing all suddenly gathering together into this single perfect moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. "Sarah," he whispered, "we're going to have a child," she said, tears of happiness spilling freely down her cheeks now. "A real family, Nathan. Something neither of us ever let ourselves believe we'd have again." Nathan pulled her into his arms, laughing and crying at once. 20 years of grief finally completely transformed into something entirely new and entirely theirs. Later that evening, after Margaret had been told and had promptly burst into happy tears of her own, after Toby had whooped loud enough to startle the horses, after the whole ranch had settled once more into quiet, contented darkness, Nathan and Sarah walked down to the creek one final time that spring, standing exactly where they'd stood as children, exactly where they'd stood on their wedding day, watching the same patient water move steadily over the same smooth stones. "Do you remember," Sarah asked, "what you told me that very first night after you found me on the platform, that some things don't change?" "I remember. I think you were right," she said, resting her head against his shoulder, one hand still pressed protectively over the new life growing within her. 20 years, a false name, a criminal conspiracy, a kidnapping and a trial that nearly broke both of us, and somehow we still ended up exactly here, together, by this same creek. Nathan wrapped his arms around her, looking out at the water, catching the last light of the setting sun, thinking of a frightened boy who'd waited here for weeks, believing a promise would somehow be kept, and a woman who had, against every possible obstacle life had placed between them, finally kept it. "Some people are never truly lost," he said quietly. "They just take the long way home." Sarah looked up at him, love and certainty shining in her eyes, with none of the fear that had once lived there. "Then I suppose," she said softly, "we finally made it." And there beside the creek where their story had first begun, and had nearly ended a dozen times over, Nathan Cole and Sarah Miller stood together as husband and wife, as survivors, as two people who had lost everything once and had been given, against every reasonable expectation, a second chance neither of them intended to waste. The love that 20 years of silence and separation and danger had never once managed to erase had not merely survived. It had won.